GTPA practice number 4, reflection. So let's have a look at the booklet and see what's required. Now, describe the scope and sufficiency of initial and ongoing scope, the breadth and sufficiency. Was it effective and relevant? Section 1. Sub-criteria to identify difference between planned and active teaching and pedagogical rescue. That's important. That is very important. Give me the academic justification of thinking for it. Discuss how you collected data to use and modify your teaching assessment. Identify and justify future. So it's got data, teaching, assessment, and what would you do in the future? In other words, a story conception. Story conception. Story conception. It's great. Whether you're reflecting. Now, this is reflecting. So it's actually above, and it's not actually restating. It's reflecting upon effectiveness. What do I need to do? I reflect on the effectiveness. So I've got to hear that coming through. So it's an analytical. With reference to this, quite general. For the whole classroom, you focus students reflect on the adequacy of your data. Not repeat of your data, but adequacy of your data. Consider the reasons when you made those changes. Changes were difference between teaching, difference between modified teaching and assessment. Why were the reasons? There's no really mandatory ones. Now, this is going to say the thing that is not done well is it's not asking you to be that reflective practitioner in the sense of what some of the areas we really invested into in terms of Office UXC. We're not asking you to comment on the reflections at the end of a lesson, not comment on the reflections what your mentor thought or what you thought in my teaching, how was it? No, it's got particular focus, scope and sufficiency of data, differences between planned and active teaching, differences in how you modify your teaching assessment because of the data, and what would you do in the future. So let's go and have a look at the samples because one hasn't particularly done well. Let's look at reflection. Describe the scope, breadth, and sufficiency, adequacy of your data. So I'm supposed to hear, here's my data, was it useful? Yes, it was useful, that plan, because student professional discussions, it was highly effective. Pre-test was not sufficient. Now, that's a good reflection. I could have been improved if I could this. Ongoing data is a broad scope. Most useful with these. They kept me along the way. And I should have done more scaffolding. So how are they talking about data? Yes. Now it's a bit concise in the sense, but is it adequate? Yes, they've adequately addressed that. It could be a little bit more collaborative. Differences between planned and active teaching and the reason. Now, this is not in the moment. This is what I've got some data, and next lesson, next step teaching, the next lesson that we have. And I wonder if we can see in the book whether it does say next step. Often it does. Here we go. Identify what your future or next step teaching would be. Okay, so after the next step, not in the moment. So that's an important distinction to understand here. Move back to sample. And it says describe differences between, and so not once, it's plural. Example 1, after teaching on this independent practice, they made mistakes. I made some observation, not where it wanted to be, therefore I did this. Example number 2, I got an exit card I collected from the student. Next lesson, I adjusted. This is done really well, nice and concise, and here's my evidence of it. Here's my pedagogical reasoning. It's got academic justification. So they did describe differences between planned and reactive teaching. Discuss how to modify student progress and how assessment was. Example number 1, when they're making this homework, was my data collect that I used to monitor them. And by regular checking, I could do this. Example number 2, to monitor was a progress. That evaluated their progress. What was it? Test. This little test that they had showed me where they're up to, and they could monitor. So it's maybe not as strong, but it's is the first one is very good. So are we adequately met that? Yes, we have. The next one is saying, identify future teaching and assessment. So during this, I would do this, I would do it was useful, I would do that. Furthermore, I would do this. Yep, I think they have adequately met those 4 subject criteria. I've discussed that, probably could be a little bit more elaborative. Yes, there's one really good plan difference and one not so good. Both were good. One modified teaching practice was good, the other was not so strong. And this they did identify. So overall, yes, a good, solid to above standard of met. Going to my other primary sample, let's have a look how they went here. So I'm looking for the adequacy of data. Research here, yep, initial data gathered revealed was a mixed. So they're telling me what it revealed. Based on these, I developed differentiated teaching strategies. This was informed by adjustments. They haven't talked about whether it was useful or not. They haven't talked about its adequacy, scope, and sufficiency. Let's have a look if it gets further. The whole class data enabled me to do this. It showed me that demonstrate here. Therefore, I chose these teaching tools, and then it hasn't discussed the scope and sufficiency of data. Focus students, the learner profiles I collected, just telling me all the data they used quite well. That's not, and how you then responded as a teacher, but it doesn't say about the scope and sufficiency. Now, that enabled me to do this a little bit more. I incorporated this, aligned to my reasoning was this, demonstrated, and I went through students A, B, and C and how they use the data. So the restating tax section number 1. Now, I'm probably trying to infer here, do what I call a where's Wally, try and find out in all that did they describe the scope and sufficiency? Well, they described how they used the data, but they didn't actually critically tell me the scope and sufficiency. I don't think that's been adequate for that one. So let's see if there's any more that comes. Now, ongoing data. School context, during this, I use continuous data collection. It allowed me to modify connected prior learning. No real evidence of that. There's no evidence here. Formative assessment, I use all these things, and that allowed me to do this in response, but it's very generalized, so there's no evidence. So I'm looking for next step teaching. I'm looking for how you changed your teaching in response to the data, very general. Student A, going through what you do with student A through conferencing. I adjusted my questioning, I modified my approaches. So there's a little bit of responsiveness to the data, but not a lot. Next step in future teaching. First though, I would do more of this. I differentiated that and so on. So maybe this is just borderline achieving the last criteria. So going for the whole criteria, they didn't really decide the scope and sufficiency of data. They generalized, talked about that, and had some pedagogic reasons. And it's just below or maybe threshold achievement. I used formative assessment to modify my teaching, very, very generalized. And maybe just got over the line on that last one. So overall, I don't think they answered what was being asked. So this is an example of the headings really different, were different to what's here. Because the headings they used were different, what they wrote about was different to what I'm marking against. So they fell into a little trap because if I look at the headings, they are different. Well, some of them are the same, but they have collated them differently. And I suggest that it probably didn't have enough words because in some sections, in section number 3, they went a little bit over what they needed to do. Sorry, that's for section number 2 here. Because they used a section of assessment 4, assessment of learning, which were, again, different headings than what was required under the rubric. That meant they wrote probably more than they needed, and they ran out of words, so to speak. I'm not sure what the reason was, but it just didn't. section number 4. So a few takeaways for everyone here about what ensure that you're answering what's required. You're reflecting upon, not recounting or just re-describing. You're reflecting upon data. You're reflecting upon your teaching as implemented changes. You're reflecting upon your assessment, form assessment, etc., and how you modify your teaching. And then you're going to reflect, not just cast into the future. So it's a higher order thinking as opposed to re-describe in section 4.